my last video on it, but I keep having new realizations and discovering new things and new ways of doing this, because after all, this is all a work in progress, that I always just have to keep making new theories and new experiments based on them. So the thumb upon the index finger, which is a pretty peculiar idea, but it is something that we see in archery a lot, and we see it in many different ways. Now, the problem with Syrianos' manual is that it's not very specific in its descriptions, but it's also the most direct descriptions that we have. And so we know that the characteristic of this kind of draw and of those three draws is, number one, some use the three fingers, which we can say is some variation of a Mediterranean draw. I have my own ideas of how it may have been done, because horseback is a little different from infantrymen. But nonetheless, I will get to that later, in another video, that is. We also have the opposite, the thumb upon the index finger. Instead, it's the finger upon the thumb, and that's obviously a thumb draw. For the obvious reasons that it's held deeper in the hand, it's also described as being done alongside a fuller draw, or a draw that's pulled back a little further. So we have that. At the same token, there's also the index finger upon the thumb. Now, there's many ways that this can be actually done, and I'll show you. Of all the ways you could technically press the thumb on the index finger, the most direct way is this, all right? Another way is this. Another way is this, all right? Another way is this. All right, and that's about all the ways that it can be done. So based on the language, it's kind of implying that it's a specific kind of draw. But then again, language itself, just like in many written sources, can also be deceiving. So what other way are we supposed to interpret this other than just take the characteristic of this kind of draw and interpret it for ourselves? How else is it supposed to be determined? Because the whole point of this manual that Syrianos wrote is to be able to take his words at face value. And so if he didn't provide any other description of this, then it's kind of, while implicative of a direct and specific kind of draw, as he says that there's three of them, and he doesn't say that there's many ways of doing these other things, but nonetheless, it's a very complex equation. The fact that you can even do different kinds of draws for different purposes already shows that it's very complex based on the situation, based on the context. Now, it really just comes down to what it is more likely to be. And if you want my opinion on that, I personally believe that what it's most likely to be is a deeper kind of curled version, or just some version of a Slavic draw. I think it could be something like this. Now, my reason is that these are supposed to be heavier bows used for warfare. And one of the things, the most direct thing that you could say, is that they have a primary draw. But the thing is that these are done on very specific kinds of bows, which are very weak, and they have basically no curl over them. The best way, at least for this 45-pound bow, is basically just to be able to pinch it, and then like press with these two is just called a tertiary draw. It's very weak. There's a belief, and the fact that we see evidence of this sort of pinch draw is kind of where this idea of the Homeric breast draw came from, because these are primitive draws in the Archaic period and the Mycenaean period. And so, because these are weak, you really could only get it to a certain point before being forced to release it. Sort of like a shoot and go kind of thing. And this is kind of believed, this is the origin of the Homeric breast draw. Because we do hear that the breast draw in this manual also exists, which could be done in a number of different ways. I don't think it's this, because you still want to have a secure kind of lock if you're trying to use a heavier bow, which the manual also says one way to increase your power is to use a heavier bow. That pretty much speaks for itself. Everybody knows that. To my other thing, what I think it's most likely to be, and it's because that there were Slavs in the empire at the time, is any variation of a Slavic draw, and specifically one that does technically pinch the back of the arrow, but because you have this deeper curl, then what that is it has more leverage over the bow, so you can pull back further. You can draw it to the neck. With the distal phalanxes, it kind of makes a little sense, because then what Syrianos said is that these three draws should be used interchangeably as a way of being able to relieve tension on the fingers. And so if you're using the three-finger Mediterranean draw, if you were to say that this is exactly what a Mediterranean draw, this is supposed to be a Mediterranean draw, you're using these three distal phalanxes, and then when you switch it, then you're using the same distal phalanxes or the grooves on these two fingers. And so basically it kind of kills the whole point of you using this. So what I like to do is as in Sassanid theoretical archery, is that it's not actually done here, but done distally, or not distally, the proximal phalanx. And so you have like a deeper curl. And it's not a smooth release, it's not as sharp of a release, but it's a release nonetheless. It'll still work and you still have good leverage over the bow. Then you can basically still pinch the arrow as well. It's a good, nice, strong draw. The other way I've kind of interpreted it is, instead of it being laid, the index finger being laid across, instead it's just kind of pointed down, as I've seen some people do, and therefore it's like a more direct pinch. And so it resembles something like this. So a pinch here, and it's kind of going underneath the arrow, but at the same time you still have this lock. Again, still, it's kind of forcing you to use the distal grooves, which doesn't exactly make sense if you're talking about trying to relieve your fingers from the Mediterranean draw. But nonetheless, it is a draw that can be used. To take into consideration the idea that this is just his opinion on how you should do it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually did use all these three different, like every single archer used these three draws for that reason. They could have easily have just done one, or they could have followed his advice. It's very complex. It's very hard to say if this was actually done, or if this was just good advice that wasn't ever actually taken into consideration, or if it was. What is another way I can think about it? Well, we also have to understand that a lot of them were on horseback, right? And so what that is that is an unstable surface. So one of the ways that I see Turkish archers, people who practice Ottoman archery, do is they tend to jump up and down as if they're on a really wild horse. I don't think horses necessarily run that wild, but they do jump up and down. And so, as you can see here, that if I have this Mediterranean draw right here, then if I was to jump, these out of the way, if I was to jump up and down, you see that my arrow's just bouncing all over the place. So you need to have a little bit of control over that. Why the thumb draw is a thing in Eastern warfare is because the main modus is horse archery and a lot of horsemanship for the most part. The index finger locks down the arrow, therefore it can hold it in place. Now that is not to say that you can't lock it down on the left side. As you can see here, I will show you a way, and that something similar to this comes from a later French manual, right? And so you have a three-finger draw, but instead it is held with the proximal groove of the index finger and the distal groove of the last finger. Now you can have a two-finger variation of this, which I kind of notice in a lot in the Stuttgart Psalter, something similar like that. Now I know historical art and iconography can itself be a rather controversial subject, because we don't know who the artist is or if they really intended to portray anything accurately. What we do know is that they are people in their time, and they're portraying something that they're aware of. They have to be aware of something. Everybody knows what a bow looks like, and you could technically see that two fingers, while it's a very common thing in iconography across a lot of European art, it's also a thing that can be done in real life. So it's something that can be replicated. Because something similar is described in an actual written manual, instead it's just the three fingers, you could technically use the two fingers in a very similar fashion with a rather deep curl. So basically it's just being pulled by the proximal grooves. And in this way, because there's a deep curl, you're technically also have a good leverage over the back of the arrow, so that if you're on a horse, then it's not moving as much. Now, if you want a more secure lock, then you could technically do the same thing, but place the thumb on the index finger. You can see, so it's a deep curl. So in that case, it's not going to be as sharp of a release. It's going to be kind of a blunt release, but again, that's just one minus compared to this other positive. So everything's kind of a give and take. And that's what I mean by complex equation. So in this case, on the unstable surface, I have it kind of locked down with my thumb here. So it's a 2-finger draw with proximal grooves, and I have it locked down. You see my arrow's going nowhere. So we don't see anything like this in modern contexts, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist, primarily because modern contexts are not the same as historical contexts. In historical contexts, there's a lot more to just being able to stand at attention and shoot at a stationary target. You have to do all sorts of other things like shoot on the move, shoot on horseback, shoot basically into a group of men. So when it comes to warfare archery, it's not the same as Olympic archery, where you're standing stationary and trying to hit a target 70 meters away. You know, that's something that requires very precise precision, but in warfare, it's its own kind of precision. You know, there's all sorts of other things that you have to kind of take into consideration. Speaking in this kind of context where in horseback, where you have the 2-finger draw like this, but then you would even secure it even more so by pressing the thumb on the index finger. And better yet, because this is these use different portions of the finger from a Mediterranean draw, right? Then it fits the bill of what Syrianos is suggesting. Primarily because then tension and relief to the other aspects of the finger. If the 2 fingers are supposed to be this, and then the 3 fingers are this, it kind of makes sense that you're giving a little extra strength, but you're not actually relieving the tension as much on those fingers, at least not as much. And in fact, funny enough, we actually see something similar to this in Byzantine art, even though it's like one piece of evidence, but nonetheless, it is kind of a portrayal of 2 fingers, and because it's a very common theme, it's kind of hard to say that it didn't kind of exist in real life. If you want to try this out yourself, then this kind of makes sense. Now there's another way to look at this, and that's of those that use the 2 fingers, as Syrianos says, one is the thumb on the index finger and one is just the opposite. In this case, just the opposite is the thumb draw, but because the thumb draw itself technically only uses 1 finger, which is the thumb, on the string and is supported by the index finger, that's not really 2 fingers on the string, but it is 2 fingers being used because one is being used to support it. So there's a good case, a good argument to be made that this probably isn't the case because of the fact that this technically also supports that. So then how would this not be any different than just 3 fingers at that point? It's a very complex equation. We don't really know it. That's not going to stop me from wanting to kind of interpret this in different ways and to be able to practice it based on the suggestions by the author. While the thumb draw itself is supported by the index finger, you could say that because the thumb is the only finger on the string, it being locked down by the index finger does make it 2, because that is actually 2 fingers supporting the tension of that. In summary, if you were to ask me, I think that the Slavic draw is the most likely candidate. I think that makes the most sense. Something like a Slavic pinch draw makes a lot of sense, really. But I also vouch for this kind of Frankish draw. I'll have another video on Frankish archery coming up. I'm kind of looking at the Stuttgart Psalter and seeing all this sort of artwork, and there's kind of a lot of things that you could take away from it, even if we don't necessarily trust the source itself. For right now, I'll just call this something similar to a Frankish draw, so something more German in origin, probably.
starting to scratch up my hand.